week. I'm Fiona Bawdon and I'm coming to you live from North London. I have two of my LAPG colleagues in the studio with me, Chris Minnick, CEO, and Rohini Tether, who's Head of Parliamentary Affairs. Give us a wave. And we are all very excited about this evening, partly because it's the first time we've been out since Christmas, but also because we will be joined shortly by David Lammy MP. David is joining us by Zoom. He is socially distanced at home, but he's not far away because, like me, he is a proud North Londoner. Although, unfortunately for David, he is a proud North Londoner who supports the wrong North London football team, which is a subject we won't be chatting about this evening. We are going to start by hearing from Nicola McIntosh, Honorary QC, who is co-chair of LAPG and one of the most brilliant mental capacity lawyers in the country. Nicola will be telling us about what LAPG has in store for us this week. After that, we'll be seeing some highlights from the APPG on legal aid sustainability, which is being run by my colleague Ro, who we saw just now. And then we will round off the evening with the launch of the 2021 Legal Aid Lawyer of the Year Awards. So do stay tuned. If you can't stay with us right to the end, please do put 6th of July in your diaries now, which is the date of the ceremony where the winners will be announced. But nominations open this evening. You can follow us on Twitter for more information. So all that and David Lammy live too. So it's going to be a very special evening and I'm delighted that you're with us. If you are tweeting about this evening or the conference for the rest of the week, could you use the hashtag, which should be on your screens now? Please do send us your questions for David Lammy. You can use the same hashtag and tweet them to us, or you can use the chat box on your YouTube screen. We've already had quite a few tweets. This conference has already generated a lot of interest and excitement online. So I'm just going to read a couple of those out just to set the scene. So the first one is from Karen Buck, MP, who is chair of the APPG on legal aid sustainability and a great friend to legal aid. And Karen says, fair and equitable access to justice demands an effective legal aid system, but that system is under strain as never before. And then she reminds us that this week's commission session will be hearing from clients who are obviously the most important people in the legal aid scheme. We've also had a nice message from young legal aid lawyers who are the future of this fine profession, and they say, start your engines. It's the first event of the LAPG conference today, and also the launch of the Legal Aid Oscars, aka the LALYs. And then one final tweet from solicitor Sue James, who says she's looking forward to the LAPG conference, and then adds, only legal aid lawyers could pull off a conference programme covering advice needs in Wales and Caribbean cocktails. And then she adds, good to see LAPG covering all the essentials. And there's Sue. I hope you can see her with her quarantini glass. So cheers, Sue. Have one of those for me. We're now going to go to hear from Nicola McIntosh, who's going to talk to us about the conference. So,
welcome to the Legal Aid Practitioners Group very first virtual annual conference for 2021. We're so very pleased that we can bring you the superbly best of LAPG in virtual form. But more of that later. What a year. Really, what a very difficult time for each and every one of us. Of all the things that we expected, it wasn't a virus which would completely change not only our view of the world, but the way that we live and work and our relationships with one another. But the impact of the pandemic on vulnerable and people on the lowest incomes has just been catastrophic. And unfortunately, we know that the worst is yet to come. As legal aid practitioners, we know how to adapt, and we are nimble and we are creative. But we need help. That help will come partly from LAPG's amazing array of workshops and sessions this week as part of our conference. LAPG will help you to navigate the operation of legal aid, and we will bring practitioners together in our legal aid community. There has never been more of a need than now, but support also needs to come from government. Despite this terrible virus, now is an opportunity. It is the opportunity to place justice where it should be in the political arena. Up there with health and up there with education. The government has supported different sectors, and in particular businesses and employers, with grants even being made to estate agents. But not legal aid practitioners, not high street legal aid firms. We are an integral part of the justice system. We go into care homes, we go into hospitals, we go into prisons and courts despite all of the risks. We represent the homeless, the vulnerable, the dispossessed, and those fleeing persecution and abuse. We are key workers. We are in the front line, and we need to be recognised for the vital work that we do. Without us, there is no justice for anyone. So it is vital that government is vocal, that government supports and champions the essential work of legal aid lawyers throughout the criminal, civil and family justice system. Come on, ministers. Come on, Chancellor. Come on, government. Strip out the unnecessary bureaucracy, strip out the unnecessary administration, and help us to deliver justice for the public, for everyone. And for legal aid practitioners, I know that you will get so much from our wonderful sessions this week. And finally, I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you for all of your commitment and your hard work that you do for your clients. We know how difficult it is. We know how hard it is, and LAPG is here to support you.
Well, thank you, Nicola, for that rallying cry for legal aid lawyers and for the life-changing work that they do. Amazing. As you saw there, Nicola is absolutely passionate about social justice and her clients, and it's very fitting that our guest this evening, David Lammy, is equally committed to social justice, although in his case using politics rather than the law. So I'm going to introduce David now. David was Shadow Justice Minister and Shadow Lord Chancellor. He is the MP for Tottenham and was elected in 2000 at the age of 27. He was a lawyer before becoming an MP, and as I said, he has an interest in justice in the widest sense. He has been vocal in his support for victims of the Windrush scandal, and he speaks up for those who died and those who were bereaved by the Grenfell Tower fire. In 2017, he conducted a review of the criminal justice system and why Black, Asian and minority ethnic people are overrepresented in it and what should be done. His latest book, Tribes, has just come out in paperback, and in that he explores how our need to belong can make or break society. He's very active on social media. He has 700,000 Twitter followers, which he uses as a platform to speak about racial and social justice issues. He also occasionally uses Twitter to boast about his baking prowess, and I can hope you can now see this amazing photo of a cake that he and his family made for his daughter's birthday recently. Definitely made me feel very inadequate seeing that. Now, David won't remember, but I first met him in 2003 when he was legal aid minister, and I was editing a magazine called Independent Lawyer. And I wrote an article about his appointment, which I dug out when I knew I was going to be talking to him this evening. And in that article, I reported that he was an ex-barrister, that he listed social exclusion as one of his interests, but also I reported in the final sentence of the piece, and I'm going to quote from it now, Lammy, 31, was also voted one of Westminster's top 10 groovers by the clubbing magazine Mixed Match. So, David, I take it you've given up grooving for baking since lockdown.
I can't believe you found that. And I've totally forgotten. Obviously, we've met on a number of occasions since that first interview in 2003, but I'd totally forgotten that that you interviewed me when I was a young minister.
I'm delighted to be able to remind you of that, David. I talked about your baking skills, and it's clear from all your writing the importance of family and community to you. And I just wanted to start by asking you, how important is it to you that you are MP for the area where you were born and grew up?
I'm really, really sure that I would not be an MP. Really, I don't think it would have happened such that I could have become an MP were it not for being the MP for my home area. The only other area of the country that I think I could represent is Peterborough, where I spent 7 years of my life. But when I speak and stand up in Parliament, people know I'm speaking sort of and from the people of Tottenham, and people like the people of Tottenham. And that, I think, is really important. So I can't imagine representing anywhere else, and I'm not sure it turned out that way.
No, and you're quite unusual, I think, for an MP to actually represent the constituency where you were born.
Well, when I came into Parliament, there was a sort of tendency, a careerism, a lot of people being shoehorned into seats. You did PP at Oxford, you went to work for a Prime Minister, whether it was Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Margaret Thatcher, all of the famous names of my era, the Miliband brothers, Cameron, Osborne, Ed Balls, fall into that sort of mould. I didn't fall into that mould. It's changed a bit. I do think that the pendulum swung back a little bit so that people have a connection to their local area, and they certainly live in it or are sort of from it. There was a bit of that started to happen during the Corbyn leadership of the Labour Party, particularly of my party.
And you mentioned that you went to boarding school in Peterborough. I know you went from there to SOAS and then to Harvard to study law. So why law at that stage, and why then did you give up law for politics?
Well, do you want the real story, Fiona? I mean, there was a show on TV at the time called LA Law, and there was a black guy in it called Blair Underwood, and I quite fancied being him. It was a big show. And, you know, I was an inner city kid that sort of fixed on him. And I a lot of people try to put me off becoming a barrister. You know, I remember my careers teacher saying that that would not be possible because this was an era in which to say you wanted to be a barrister, you really had to be upper middle class. And there wasn't in a public imagination that a barrister could possibly look like me.
You've mentioned in your book that you went from being the only black boy at your school in Peterborough to being the only black Briton at Harvard. So it really was, you were blazing a trail, no doubt about it.
Yeah, and ended up with a massive imposter syndrome at the end of all that journey. I think I then go on to write about.
You say that, but then you became head boy at your school, which is the most extraordinary part of that story,
I know.
I think.
Well, look.
How did you do that?
Well, hang on. Let's get the serious point is we're still in a position, it's still happening, where black people are constantly the first. So I've had lots of firsts in my life, but I'm still meeting young black people who are they're the first to do this, the first to do that. And that's because we've just, there's so much to do in relation to inequality and racial justice in our country. I mean, look, I got a lot of support. I had some great teachers, great mentors. I acquired a kind of resilience to do things, and a lot of it was mishap. I went to Harvard because there were black kids ahead of me, a bit older than me, who were being failed by the Inns of Court School of Law. They were taking the Inns of Court School of Law to court. And I decided that I better have a plan B. So Harvard was a plan B. Wow. It wasn't the plan A. And I found pupillage really tough. A year-long pupillage, again, was not easy.
Yeah. You've talked about the difficulties of black kids getting into law or forging those kind of opportunities. And in your criminal justice review, you talk about a trust deficit. I'm talking now about the statistics that show that black defendants don't tend to take advice, don't tend to plead guilty as early as their white counterparts, and so end up being penalised for that. Tell me what you mean by trust deficit, and do defence lawyers have a role to play in that?
Well, look, I think that the fundamental trust issue begins, of course, with contact with the police. And the perennial issues that have run throughout my entire life, first of the sus laws and now of stop and search. If you're black in London, you're 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched. Very hard, I think, to be a black Londoner and make it to the age of 23, 25 without being stopped and searched on numerous occasions. I've been stopped and searched on numerous occasions. And of course, what it does is if you're innocent, you're never doing anything wrong, but you're told to put your hands up and all the rest of it in public, you start to lose your trust really with the police. I think that particularly if you're treated badly in that experience, and sometimes that is the case. In fact, one of my boys was stopped and searched for the first time just a few weeks ago.
How old is he?
So 15.
Wow.
So that's where it sets in. We know that ethnic minorities, when they arrive in England as newly arrived immigrants, are very positive. Trust levels are high. They're comparing it with the countries from which they've come. We know, and subsequent generations, the trust levels diminish. And it's a real issue because it's the scales of justice that are become unbalanced, and that's what I found. But the truth is, I also found in my review that across, people tend to focus on the police, but right across the system, contact with magistrates, juries, CPS. Sadly, if you're on remand, don't forget that in London, 90% of young people on remand today are from a black, Asian, and minority ethnic background. That is an extraordinary figure, and conveys why this trust is not a surprising thing. Why would you? It's probably the truth.
I saw in your review you report that 41% of under 18s in custody are black, which is a staggering figure.
Yes, but that was in the review, Fiona. It's now 51%.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's why I get so upset about my review, because it's got worse, not better, since doing the review. And, you know, the recommendations have not been fully implemented. And in fact, if I were publishing the review today, I would go further than I went when I was commissioned to do the review 5 years ago.
And we saw last year the young black barrister Alexandra Wilson tweeted about being mistaken for the defendant in court. And there's obviously two assumptions going on there. One is that the defendant will be black, and also that the barrister won't be. So, you know, we're failing on both of those. So with you...
I think so. I mean, I spoke to Alexandra and I was really touched that on one level, it was slightly depressing. You know, not much has changed. I remember that experience myself as a young lawyer. I remember it as a young member of parliament in a way. But, you know, at the same time, it's probably true to say that if you look at the proportion of ethnic minorities and indeed black people at the bar, it has gone up. It does look good. It's why, for example, it's really concerning that we have been so slow and so poor to appoint black and minority ethnic judges and get a judiciary that's representative of the country. And that's where I think it really is. People applying, but not getting through.
Right. Okay. I just want to talk to you a little bit about your book, Tribes. I couldn't work out whether it's a hopeful or a pessimistic book. What would you say?
I think it depends from the lens from which you're reading it, Fiona. I mean, I think that, look, the book comes out of a period where we're very divided. It's called Tribes for a reason. It's basically the phenomenon of a new tribalism that exists in our society. I started to write it out of therapy in a way because so many people were challenging my right to be English, to be British. You know, why do you hate our country so much? People would say, as well as all the death threats and other things I was receiving. And so the book is part memoir, as you know, where I, you know, take a DNA test and reveal where I'm from, or where my ancestors were from, which was in part Niger. I talk about my life in Peterborough and visit that town, and lots of friends who voted to leave the European Union and have strong views about immigration. I talk about growing up black in Tottenham, but then I come out the other end and talk about our country. And yeah, that's a mixture, isn't it, of hope and real fears. And, you know, we're in a recession amidst a pandemic that's revealed real inequality across our society. So, but, you know, I try and come up with some solutions and what we should be doing to move forward.
And one of the things I wanted to ask you about, obviously, was the pandemic, and what impact is that having in your constituency? What are you seeing?
It's having a dramatic impact. It's having a dramatic impact. I am worried about vaccine hesitancy as we speak, and ethnic minorities not feeling comfortable taking the vaccine when called up. Death and grief has been immense across black and brown communities. So many people that I've known at the mosque, so many people at local churches lost their lives. Most black families have been affected in some way. And then, of course, the recession is deep. You know, when you shut down retail, when you shut down our, you know, coffee stores, when offices are no longer needing to be clean because there are no workers, no security, those are my constituents who are now unemployed or on furlough, potentially looking at unemployment when it all ends. So I'm really, really worried. The Times did a report and they estimate that unemployment in Tottenham is about 45%. It's amongst the worst in the country. Very serious indeed.
My goodness. I mean, one of the things that's really striking for you, David, is how the political is personal. I was just looking through all the sort of seminal seismic events that we've been through in the last few decades, and in nearly all of them, it seems to me, you have a personal connection, either that's been thrust on you or that you have assumed for yourself. Obviously, the riots in 1985 and 2011, it started in Tottenham. the Windrush scandal. We all remember the powerful speech that you made, but you say in your book that you couldn't help thinking about your mum and your aunties when that all blew up. And obviously, in your speech, you talk about it being a day of shame for the nation, and it was incredibly powerful stuff. And then obviously in Grenfell, you had a tragic personal connection. You lost a family friend. Do you think, if without that personal connection, would you have been so vocal about Grenfell, or are you kind of speaking up for the person that you knew who isn't able to speak for herself any longer?
Could he just say, who worked for my wife and lost her life in Grenfell? Look, I think that I don't quite know how to answer that. There's also Brexit, in which I had a sort of visceral reaction to Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and the kind of cranked up xenophobia and anti-immigration rhetoric now personified by Priti Patel that I think we were feeling as a result of Brexit. So I think politics is personal. I like to speak from an authentic position. I tend to stay in politics. There are lots of important issues in foreign policy, for example, defence. I'm very much associated, I think, with domestic policy and the tough end of domestic policy: race, poverty, education, crime. And so I speak from that experience, and I think that is what gives me the authority these days to sort of say what I need to say.
Very striking that you describe Grenfell as a monstrous crime, not a tragedy, which I think was really powerful.
Well, it was very important, the intervention I made very early on, and I remember ringing up the Today programme literally on the second day, and they put me on, Sarah Sands, the editor, because I said someone needs to make it clear that this amounts to corporate manslaughter. It was being described as a terrible deed when it was a preventable fire. And there is a police investigation, which we tend to hear nothing about, by the way. But let's be clear, it was a preventable fire, and a lot of people and a lot of lawyers would recognise the ingredients for corporate manslaughter.
They would. David, thank you. I'm sorry to cut you off. We're now going to go to our second short film of the evening, and this is some of the highlights from the APPG into legal aid sustainability. David was one of the witnesses at the last session, so I think he may be appearing briefly in this film as well. So if you stay with me, David, and we'll be back to you in just a few minutes.
My work is mainly acting for children and parents in care proceedings.
We have a whole practice which is criminal defence legal aid.
The vast majority of my work is for tenants and for homeless people.
The sort of work that we do deals with the most vulnerable adults and children in society, and they need to have good representation because they are facing the loss of their children from their care potentially, and potentially losing the legal right to be considered that child's parent.
I represented a young man with learning disabilities who was living with his family at home, but he was being kept overnight in a kennel outside his house. We put his case before the court that he wanted to live alone, away from them and not being abused.
At the moment I am focused on improving the working lives of black barristers, increasing their visibility and lobbying for change in the profession.
The ability to access justice regardless of class, creed, background, income is the bedrock of a fair and just society.
Children with special educational needs and disabilities are increasingly being failed by a system that's designed to support them.
Legal aid should be available for all victims of domestic abuse, irrespective of means to pay.
When clients come to us, they're almost always in dire need. It's not an exaggeration to say that the cases that we deal with are often involve life and death issues.
We recently lost a very good assistant solicitor who said, look, I love the work, but I'm at a point in my life where I need financial security.
I love my job. I think it's an enormous privilege what I do. you know, I want to have a life at some point, and I'm not sure if that's something that I can actually do in 5-10 years from now.
I think that a well-funded public interest legal system is like public health. It's about building institutions and values which protect us all, the rule of law.
At the moment, too many people are coming to court. If we had early legal advice, we could divert people away from court, preserving court for those people who most need it.
I would like to give you a sort of grassroots perspective of what's going on out there, because it feels a little bit frustrating at the moment. We're doing a lot of shouting and we don't feel like we're being heard.
Which party, which administration is going to have the courage of conviction to actually repair this problem? Because if we don't, public confidence in the legal profession and the justice system will drop even lower than it is now, and we will see more miscarriages of justice.
It can be physically and emotionally draining for us. It can also lead to vicarious trauma, but it is also absolutely extremely rewarding. I personally enjoy and take pride in giving a voice to the voiceless, assisting people who really need help, who are suffering, who are marginalised by society.
I welcome the work that you're doing. I think it's very, very important.
I'm absolutely passionate about this work, and I'm absolutely passionate about legal aid.
It's all about making sure we've got a better society for everybody.
That's the thrill of the publicly funded bar. We're there to be able to empower our clients.
David, we're back. The young black barrister in that film, Mikey Etienne, seemed to me ask the absolutely key question, which is which party, which administration is going to solve the problem of legal aid? And I just wondered what your answer to him would be to that question. Is it going to be Labour?
Well, I hope not, in the sense that I hope we can solve the problem long before that. Look, the Labour Party lost the last general election badly. We were reduced to the worst figures since 1935. We've got to win 124 seats to get a majority of one at the next general election, and that doesn't look like it's going to be any time before 2024. Can we really wait until 2024 for the Labour Party to fix this problem?
So do you think
I hope we...
appetite for it?
Well, we've got CLAR 2, and it needs to deliver. And it's my job to make sure that I keep my, how can I put it, my foot on the pedal in terms of Robert Buckland, to make sure that CLAR 2 delivers. Look, we've got this shocking position where LASPO has been an unmitigated disaster. Look, the latest figures I've got in front of me are that since 2017, more professionals have left the sector than joined it. The number of newly trained legal professionals joining the public funded has decreased by 47% since the pandemic. We know that there are vast now advice deserts across the country. And the average age of a duty solicitor is older than I am.
So it's not looking
so that can't wait. That's an urgent problem unless we think that the sort of worst public defender systems that you see in parts of the United States is something that we want to now mimic. And of course, the costs will be greater. And let's be clear, the budget for legal aid, when the Labour Party was in power, was cut from 2.9 billion to 1.6 billion. And that was an eye-watering cut. Yeah. And I'm afraid that has had a huge, huge effect, alongside the fact that our courts were cut, they disappeared, in fact, which is a problem that we've got now with the backlog. So all of it mounts up, Fiona. So, of course, a Labour government, and I hope as Justice Secretary, to attend to these issues. But I'm praying and hoping that Robert Buckland will deliver sometime before then, and the sector don't sort of just sit back and wait, because I'm not sure we'll have much to save if we wait another 4 years.
Isn't one of the problems that there's no political cost to cutting legal aid? There's huge social cost, but no politician has lost votes through cutting.
Well, I think that's changing. One, you can't promise to level up the country, to deal with the problems that we see in the so-called Red Wall and those northern constituencies and seaside towns, and then have the advice deserts that we currently have.
So you would see
you can't say
of legal aid as key to the levelling up agenda.
Absolutely. And we're in a deep recession.
Well, I think there's a lot of
where's the housing advice?
You say that, David.
Where's the welfare advice? Where is the funding, the real funding to law centres?
Absolutely.
I'm afraid you can't deliver on that. And you know what? It's becoming clearer and clearer to me when we see that 90% of those on remand are black here in London. When you see that 51% of young offenders come from a black, Asian or minority ethnic background, again, it's becoming acutely clear that some of the accumulating problems we've got do come back to legal aid, and the support for parents, welfare, housing, family law breakup, all of that. Do we really want to go back? I remember reading Bleak House for A-level at A-level English, where we've got quite as many litigants in person as we currently have. I mean, it's just, this is not a system that works and functions.
The Windrush scandal may have been that there was no legal aid for immigration laws, so people were left on their own trying to wrestle with the Home Office bureaucracy. But I don't remember hearing a politician talk about legal aid in quite those terms before. Are you unique, or has the penny finally dropped among some political circles, do you think?
I think that it was the case if we went back 14, 15 years, that the legal aid budget had become large, and that there were a series of cases generating, quite a lot of remuneration for a very small minority of very senior barristers.
You're not talking about fat cat lawyers, are you, David?
Well, fat cat, I've never described them. I don't think that term applies. That was a problem that needed to be dealt with. It was dealt with. But then what was taken to the system was an axe that has seen the disappearance of law firms up and down the high street, an axe that's seen the collapse of the junior bar, and it cannot be right. What the hell has a few senior QC salaries got to do with the access to legal services in Scunderland or Scunthorpe? Nothing.
Absolutely.
Is the truth.
Absolutely. You talked about the courts backlog, and obviously that's been made much worse since pandemic, but it certainly wasn't caused by the pandemic. And you talked about the need to cut juries. I know that has raised concerns among some lawyers about what the impact of that might be, and then also that these things that are meant to be temporary have a horrible habit of becoming permanent. What would you say to people who have those concerns?
Well, look, I recognise those concerns, and, that suggestion was not made lightly. Look, with great respect to my profession, there is a serious problem with the backlog. 56,000 cases and growing is a huge problem. And by the way, there are some that suggest, we've had a problem before of backlogs. No, we didn't. We had nothing like this under us, because even if you had 50,000, 51,000 backlog, the court capacity at that time was vastly different. We had many, many more courts. We've cut the courts by 50%, and the sitting days that we had was much more significant. So the problem we have now is new and particular and dangerous. So then you get to, what do we do about the problem? And there are only a number of things you can do. We called for Nightingale courts. We wanted 200. Her Majesty's Court Service initially said there'd be 200. There are 23. That's a scratch of the surface. Yeah. We know that we need more sitting days. We wait to see what Rishi Sunak will grant the Lord Chancellor, but you'll understand probably we ought to be sceptical about whether Robert Buckland will pull off the sitting days that's required. So then you do have to do some radical things, and that's where wartime juries comes in, but not because it's ideal. I don't suggest it because it's ideal, and it has to have a sunset clause, and it has to end this year. It's just because it can increase capacity slightly. It's because I know that what they're thinking about is playing around with either one trials and sending more things to our magistrates or diploc courts. And I'm afraid that's something that we really must avoid at all costs.
But what about, I mean, in your criminal justice review, you say that juries is one part of the criminal justice system where black defendants don't get disproportionate treatment. Are you worried about what the impact of smaller juries on that might be?
Well, look, we want juries per se. The real threat to juries is no juries at all. Yeah. That's the real threat to juries. And by the way, if you've got 90% of young people on remand being black, something's already wrong in the system. If you've got 51%, something's already wrong in the system. So I think we overstate this slightly if we put it all down to smaller juries. No, the truth is that horse is bolted, and the real threat is having no juries at all.
Okay, thank you. I've just got a couple of questions now which have been sent in to us. One says, with the pandemic and the additional restrictions that we're all living under, a lot of people who have previously never had any interaction with the police are now, you know, sort of finding out what it's like to be asked where you're going and what you're doing. Do you think there will be more interest in how the law impacts on all of us post-pandemic?
I think that people are understanding the power of the state and state control in a way that they never thought possible. I think that they're understanding that it can feel rather arbitrary. I think that it sits alongside a government also that is frivolous with the rule of law, handing out procurement contracts to friends, proroguing Parliament, the markets bill that took our coach and horses through the Good Friday Agreement. All of this is cumulative. And so I do think that there's a renewed, of course, we've still got the review of judicial review and human rights coming. I do think that there is a renewed interest in the law. And it reminds me, frankly, of the era in which I qualified as a lawyer, when, you know, great lawyers like Mike Mansfield, Helena Kennedy were making their name, and there were these big cases, the Tottenham 3, the Guildford 4, the Birmingham 6, the poll tax riots. It was a big era, and it feels like that once again.
Indeed. Another question just says, when people think about legal aid, they think about crime. Why doesn't civil legal aid, which you have talked about very passionately earlier, why doesn't that get the same headlines? Why is nobody interested in civil legal aid?
Well, it should get the same headlines, because I'm sort of convinced that some of the dramatic cuts under LASPO to scope and the growth in litigants in person, the loss of family, the loss of housing, or welfare, what that does is it puts such pressure on families, particularly during austerity and now during a recession, that I'm afraid it drives young people towards crime. And so I do think the two are related, and we've got to reach a much better balance than we currently have across the country.
Right. Okay, thank you. And then just one final question, again from our audience. If one of your children said, I can't decide if I want to be a politician or a legal aid lawyer, but I want to change the world, what would your advice to them be?
Oh my God, that's a really hard question. Well, I think I'd want to talk about the kind of, if they want to be a politician, the kind of politician they want to be. So Fiona, you sort of indicated this, and I think you know me well enough to know this. My politics is very much grounded in Tottenham. My surgeries that I have with people inform my politics. In fact, my first book, Out of the Ashes, is littered with stuff that comes from the constituency. If you want to be that kind of MP, then great. But if it's all about sort of watching West Wing and or House of Cards, that sort of Westminster politics, then not so much, really. I think absolutely help people on the ground, and legal aid practitioners are in the business of doing that. The challenge, I think, in law these days, and it does worry me, is the ability for young people to choose and to say, I want to go into that area of law, has largely vanished because the business of training contracts and pupillage is so competitive, and where I suspect that way too many people are qualifying with, getting law degrees and doing all the courses afterwards that lead to a professional qualification, but are not able to practice. And I think that's another area that needs much closer scrutiny, because they're ending up in substantial debt. Yeah. And I'm just not convinced they're getting the return for their money, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an incredibly expensive process to qualify. Well, it sounds as if we may have a potential future LALY winner from David's household. We'll have to wait and see. But we are now going to move to the final film of the evening. It's time for the launch of the Legal Aid Lawyer of the Year Awards. As you will all know, the LALYs are non-profit making, and they are an unashamed celebration of the work of grassroots social justice lawyers. And nominations open this evening. Very well done. It's got chilli in here, David, don't you think? Anyway, so the 2021 Legal Aid Lawyer of the Year Awards are officially launched. Nominations are open. So I would just need to thank David so much for joining us this evening. Hope to see you in person again before very long. Thank you to our sponsors, to the organisers, and everyone who has made this evening possible and will be taking part in the conference for the rest of this week. Hope to see you there. Thank you very much and goodbye.